Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to talk a bit about a new phase of the study of environmental Arctic change. We call it SEARCH. But I want to start by backing up a little bit and point out that my good friend Craig George recently published the authoritative on bowhead whales. And this is a book that shares with the world the remarkable achievements of Utqiagvik and other communities, other indigenous communities, in teaching scientists and collaborating with scientists from around the world. So for over 4 decades, Craig worked with people like Arnold Brower, Sr. and Jr., Harry Brower, Sr. and Jr., and Tom Albert, and many, many scientists to really transform knowledge of bowhead whales. So they took bowhead whales from being one of the least known whales on the planet to being one of the best known, if not the best known. It's a remarkable achievement, but it was an achievement accomplished by very patient work with a lot of people. And everybody in this community, I hope, is proud of that work. And along the way, those scientific and indigenous experts showed the rest of us what could be produced with patient, persistent collaboration. Well, there are a lot of lessons to be learned in that work, and I highly recommend the book. But a few lessons I want to point out that we've drawn from it. And the first is that it took much longer than it should have, but scientists did learn to listen to indigenous knowledge through that effort. The second is that Tom Albert's and Arnold Brower Sr.'s patience in keeping everyone at the table has paid tremendous benefits to the community and to science. And the third is that pulling together is necessary, in that case and in many cases, to identify the right research questions. It's not enough to just send the scientists out to, it takes a lot of minds working together. We've heard about that several times today. And finally, pulling together the whalers, the scientists, and the managers took the catastrophe of a moratorium on whaling and turned it into a very robust quota from the International Whaling Commission. And I think that's important when we think about the challenges we face now. So, inspired by that work that was focused on the bowheads and similar efforts, 9 of us proposed a couple of years ago a project at aiming to bring together formally knowledge of indigenous and scientific experts to bear on increasingly urgent decisions that have to be made in the Arctic. The co-designers of this National Science Foundation funded project we call SEARCH were indigenous, scientific, and decision-making experts. We're following on the model that was created in the whaling example. So this project was just funded about 10 months ago, and the 9 of us have since recruited another 40 or so experts, indigenous, scientific, and what we call decision-making experts from diverse fields, from diverse parts of the world. And the whole goal is to bring together our collective understanding and produce what would be called actionable knowledge for decision makers. We're trying to operationalize rather than project by project. What we want to do is sort of change the culture of how we all do business in collecting information and making it useful for decision makers. It could be the mayor of the North Slope Borough, it could be the governor, it could be a corporation, could be an international body. So that's what we're trying to do, and it's a new day, I think, for us, and we're quite excited to be doing this because we recognize that we could create new outcomes and we could create a new way of doing business. So I want to now turn to a few of my colleagues from the search program who've been involved in the initiation of this work and hear their thoughts on it. And I want to start with Jackie Catalina Schaefer. Jackie's a community development manager with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. And she's a co-principal investigator of search. She was born and raised in Kotzebue. And Jackie's ability, rather remarkable ability, to communicate in Indigenous and scientific circles is of a tremendous value to our efforts. And Jackie, you've really shown us in a number of ways the powerful way of communicating important concepts through stories. And I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that and its role in what search is trying to do and more broadly in bringing knowledge from Indigenous communities and science to bear on important questions.
Sure. Well, welcome everyone. I'm glad you're still awake because now we could all see you. Before we were sitting with you falling asleep maybe. It's hard to have hard discussions after eating. So, you know, Indigenous families have food and then we take naps. So certainly that's not a story, that's our reality. And I think using the word storytelling is a great example of how we define our communicating. The word defined in Webster, storytelling, is simply someone telling or speaking a story to you, right? So, and that word was misused and misidentified when they came to our people trying to communicate, and they called our oral history storytelling. And there's a big difference between oral history and storytelling. And the oral history that continues along the Arctic, you know, for over 20,000 years, wasn't recognized until science said it was recognized. And so that in itself is a dialogue that we need to change for the future because we've much to learn from each other. Our Inupiat Ilaqasait, our value system, is interconnected with nature. We aren't disconnected. We don't have segmented ways of looking at the ecosystem. It's all interconnected. We are seasonal thinkers, and our seasonal thinking leads us to anticipation for food resources, and this continues today. What we've been able to do is to adapt in the same geographic area, regardless of the impacts from the outside world. And to me, we have changes in our climate that have accelerated in the last couple of decades that need to be addressed. So the Indigenous knowledge piece has to be incorporated into the scientific monitoring of our ecosystem. The Earth is a natural cycle system. We know that if we zoom out far enough into space, that it is simply suspended in space by a sun and a moon that control the tides. And sometimes as human beings in our Western way of thinking, we forget to zoom out to that universal perspective and recognize those things. We get so caught into one little area that we forget that it's interconnected and there's this ripple effect in this way of this natural cycle. And so when I look at co-production of knowledge systems, it's okay to be different. We have Western knowledge systems that to me are very linear. And then we have Indigenous knowledge systems, which are very circular. They're very, it's never ending. It's more like a seashell. So, and when you look at that, the importance of that is that it's never ending. So it's a continuum. When you look at some of the scientific data that's come out, it only goes to an extent because it's a snapshot in time. but that snapshot changes over time. So it's not continual. And that way of thinking, when you think Indigenous knowledge mindset, then you have the ability to kind of adjust science and utilize two ways of worldviews that apply to the same place, because we all live on the same planet. And I think that that's important. We've had examples of co-production of knowledge. This is not a new concept. We need to, what we're trying to do is find a better way so that we don't have the same mistakes that have happened in the past with science and Indigenous knowledge holders. When you look at even the example of the Bowhead studies, I mean, it took 40 years for scientists to sit and listen to the elders and acknowledge that their knowledge that they were sharing was valuable. It should have been as valuable as their education and their knowledge of the system, of the Earth cycle system in the beginning. Had that happened, then you wouldn't have a 40-year project or whatever. A more recent project that I see is moving down that right lane, where we share these two worldviews and we share these knowledge systems and create different solutions for the future, is a documentary. It was a 5-year study with IARC and the community of Kotzebue, Kikitalo, where I grew up. Ironically, a lot of my family is in that documentary, so you could tell my family is very conscious of the world around us, and we care deeply for not only the food resources, but the natural cycles that are occurring in our environment. So I think that there are great examples. I think the outcomes of what we're trying to do will hopefully be resulted in documents that could be used for multiple audiences, because we all come at this with unique perspectives. And just because those perspectives are different, it doesn't mean that anyone is right or wrong. And I think in the past, we've had that kind of shadow over whether science is more powerful than Indigenous knowledge, whether we should acknowledge that or not acknowledge that. When scientific theories are proven wrong, then in the science world, you know how that feels. So it's like we have to get to the place where we're at a new beginning, and so that the future, even the curriculum at, say, a tribal college, has that embedded into it, so that even though it's two different worldviews, we're able to pull the strengths from both and create new solutions. Yeah.
Thanks, Jackie. Martin Robards is the director of the Arctic Beringia project at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and he is a member of Search's co-production team focused on the consequences of environmental change for human well-being. Martin, you've studied marine mammals, natural resource management, fish and fisheries in the Bering Strait region and other parts of the Arctic. Your work has included efforts on behalf of the co-management of Pacific walruses. So my question for you would be, how do those experiences, how did those factor in your decision to join the Search co-production knowledge effort?
Yeah, thank you, Brendan. And thank you everybody for sticking it out this afternoon. I'd like to start to answer your question based on the working group I'm in, the working group on human well-being. I'm really happy to be in this working group. There's some other modules within Search, but I see everything starting from the human well-being perspective. What are the problems out there that are constraining human well-being? And then how do we use knowledge, Western science, traditional knowledge, to help us address those questions, come up with solutions that decision makers can then work with? And so what I'd like to do to sort of illustrate Brendan's question is to give a personal story and then a couple of examples where I see Search going that can be really positive. So my personal story is in the early 2000s, I went back to school to do my PhD at University of Alaska Fairbanks, and I went into a program, NSF-funded program, that allowed me to do an internship. I was given a 12-week stipend to do an internship with some organization. I was really fortunate at that time because I was talking last night with somebody and they said, you know what you know. And I went into this internship completely unaware of what I was going to learn. I met with Vera Metcalf and then Charlie Brower, who allowed me to intern with the Eskimo Walrus Commission. And I think that's probably one of the most important things that's happened to me in my professional career as far as changing direction. Vera had asked me to do this 12-week project for her. And what she wanted me to do was to look at all of the data that had been collected from the biosampling programs. People have been coming out to St. Lawrence Island for years to take samples of walrus. Do they have mercury in them? Do they have heavy metals in them? And her task to me was like, what does this all mean? Should we worry? Is there anything going on here? We never hear anything back. And so I spent my 12 weeks, talking to researchers, collecting the data, putting it all together. And at the end of the day, to cut to the chase, I really could tell Vera, there's nothing that I can tell you. There's data being published on levels in walrus in that fat or this, but what it means to either walrus or people, I could not tell you. And so this to me is an example of where our science, we can get publications out and the co-production of knowledge for human well-being fall through. There was a lot of well-meaning people, but we didn't come up with something that really addressed the problem. And so my first story out from that is to talk about, well, how might that have been done? And I turned to Kotzebue, a native village of Kotzebue, Alex Whiting and colleagues in that village. I'm working with Todd O'Hara, University of Alaska Fairbanks, Sarah Moses, again there, who was doing her PhD. They came at that problem very differently. They were like, we're not just gonna sample walruses or seals for contaminants and tell people these are the things to worry about. We're gonna look at the whole picture. What are the nutrient values for, how healthy is this for people to eat from a nutritional basis? Are there any things in there like mercury or heavy metals? And then what happens to that when you prepare it? It matters which part of the animal you eat. It matters how you prepare those different pieces. And what they were able to do for the village there was to provide a really informative set of recommendations that anybody could make their own decision on. Families and hunters could make their own decisions on what works. There was the overwhelming take-home message was it's a very healthy way to go. There was a couple of items that if you were a pregnant mother, you might want to show some restraint on, but those were clearly articulated, and also some preparation methods could mitigate that. So it provided information on human well-being that was good for everybody. And to me, that was a great example of a health project that did it really well and right. My second story I'd like to point to is this idea of working together and having a collective voice. There's a lawyer who's worked with the Whaling Commission for many years, Jessica Lefebvre, who always drummed this into me. There is so much strength when we can talk with a voice around a specific problem. And the work that the Eskimo Whaling Commission has done on the conflict avoidance agreements, I think is a good example of this. We had oil and gas industry looking to do seismic work. We had bowhead whales migrating up the coast in the areas they were interested in. And we have subsistence hunters needing the quiets and their lack of no disturbance to have a successful hunt. And over the years, these groups have got together in a room together with scientists, being able to bring the different forms of information together and come up with solutions for everybody to get what they need, whether that's components of economic development, whether it's supporting the bowhead whale, being able to continue to migrate and grow in population, or for people to successfully hunt those animals. And I think a big part of that is because we've had the hunters, the scientists, industry, all working together and saying, this is what we want and need. And I think something like SEARCH can do that because we have everybody working towards these common goals of well-being. The final thing I'd like to mention is an experience on St. Lawrence Island that's very different to here. I feel like when I come to Utqiagvik, there's a lot of capacity compared to what I find in Gambell or Savunga. And I see the communities striving so hard to build that capacity. And both communities developed their tribal ordinances to do self-regulation of their hunts and set up marine mammal advisory councils to look at what are the bigger picture of where we want to go managing this resource that is so important for those communities. I really don't see a lot of support reports out there. You know, they're funded by tribal wildlife grants or some philanthropic funding here and then, but we haven't institutionalized, we haven't built our infrastructure that really allows them to grow and do things like what Taklik was just talking about, of developing their own sets of questions that affect their own well-being, that can be answered by, you know, whoever, whether it's the scientists in this room or other groups of people. We need to be able to help these communities build that capacity to do those things. And I think it's going to be an important part of what this program can do. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And so I just want to point out that, you know, Martin and Jackie both work on a team we refer to as the human wellness or the human well-being team. They're focused on the consequences of environmental change for human well-being writ large. And you just said it, Martin. I mean, that's kind of the lens that you're looking at it. And in fact, that was sort of, I think, maybe the big paradigm shift in this phase of search was we're focused on environmental change in terms of consequences for people. So we have two other co-production teams. One is focused on the drivers of environmental change in the Arctic and the ecosystem consequences, and Craig George serves on that team. And then the third team is focused on the consequences of environmental Arctic change for international cooperation and economic decision-making, and Matt Hebner, who's here, serves on that team. That focus of, in human terms, is different than the way search and a lot of science organizations came at problems in the North before. I want to turn now to Athena Copenhaver. She's the assistant director for search. She's also a writer, an editor, a science communicator, and a climate interpreter. So Athena, you have considerable experience facilitating and sharing scientific knowledge. And I point out your debut novel was just published this year. So how do those experiences together influence your work with search? And what do you see as the opportunities for this complex collaboration that your colleagues have just described?
Thanks so much, Brendan. Thanks, Jackie and Martin as well for your comments. And thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I think, yes, I've had a kind of an interesting career so far. And I think what becoming a novelist has taught me is that I'm more than capable of rattling on for about 300 pages in the voice of a peculiar character. But my work in science communications is really where I'm happiest, I think, because we get to look at societal issues and the science that's being done to address those issues. But then as a communicator, my job was to make the science accessible to the people who would care the most. So working at Monterey Bay Aquarium for 7 years on the conservation research team as an operations specialist and a strategic communications specialist, it taught me to bridge the gaps between the work that needs to get done to enable the science, but then also to tell the stories in a way that the public finds them meaningful and finds them sticky, as we say. So as both Jackie and Martin were talking about finding new outcomes, new solutions through this process that search is beginning to put forth and embody, I'm particularly interested in not only finding new solutions and creating those new outcomes, but as Jackie said, asking new questions. But the way that we ask those questions, the way that we share the findings that those questions result from is equally as important. And earlier in one of our breakout groups, we talked a little bit about shifting narratives and how it's no longer my responsibility as a white person to come into a community and tell a story about them. The narrative has shifted so far away from that. So I'm really very interested in the nuance of the new stories that need to be told, and not coming in as a storytelling expert. And that word is loaded, storytelling, obviously in this context, but to come in as someone who is here to listen and not to impose any sort of prearranged structure on the stories that need to come out of this type of work. So I don't actually know what those stories are going to be just yet. I don't think Martin or Jackie knows just yet. But that's why the work that Search is doing right now is so exciting, and it's not necessarily new. Co-production of knowledge is not new, as we've learned over the past week or so at this conference, but asking those new questions, digging into the nuance of the stories that can come out of them, that's what's new and exciting, and I'm eager to be a part of. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. So I think the other thing that we learned early on is that this has to be much bigger than 9 of us or 40 of us or 50 of us. Some of the diverse organizations that are participating in our complex collaboration are listed here on this slide. But I especially want to highlight Stantec. They were a sponsor of this conference, and one of their scientists, Francis Visa, co-designed the project with us, and he serves as the co-chair of the co-production team I mentioned on the consequences of environmental change for international cooperation and economic decision-making. So I feel a great debt to Stantec. And finally, I just want to say that, you know, just as the research that Craig and his colleagues recently detailed depended on many collaborators, the search effort similarly needs a diversity of contributors. And we hope people in this audience will step up and offer their skills and knowledge. It's going to take a lot of people to kind of shift the way we do business. If nothing else, we don't want to leave the next research question like, how many bowheads are there and how sustainable is the harvest, to take years and years and years and years before people are really working effectively together. You know, Andy's done terrific work in Kotzebue and co-production. As Athena says, there are lots of good examples. We're trying to figure out how can we make this more than project by project, but more the way we all work together. Hence, we all have to pull together, and everybody. And I have to say that in pulling together this collection of scientists and policymakers and indigenous experts, everybody's got imposter syndrome, right? All of us think, I don't really care. You know, these are the experts over here. We all have to get over that. We all have something that is needed. It's not just like you can contribute. We need all of your voices in this effort to sort of change the culture of research. So with that, I'm happy to take questions, cries of outrage, whatever.
Hi. Hello. Oh, okay. So one of the questions I had was what is the ratio for youth involvement within your group?
I'm sorry, the ratio of what?
Youth involvement?
Oh, great question. I can't give you an overall ratio. I think the co-production teams as they currently exist probably are skewed towards the other end of the age spectrum. And that's partly a selection for people with deep expertise, but we think that's a lurking danger for us. We do have included in our budget funding to help involve young hunters in the work. And this is dovetails with a program that the Eskimo Walrus Commission has to involve young hunters in management and research. And so we're supplementing their budget. And the intention is to bring those people into the conversation as well.
Brandon, I'm trying to
I
understand.
don't think your mic's on, I don't think.
No. How's this? Thank you. Is this project focusing on questions about research that learns more about the Arctic natural environment, or is the primary focus about the process of how to do research? I'm struggling with that.
Yeah, so do people hear his question? Everybody? So John's question is this project focused on specific questions of environmental change in the Arctic or the process of doing the research? And I'd say neither. What we're really focused on is making what we know, we being the Indigenous community, the science community, making that, I know, yep, making that information more readily usable by people who make decisions on it, whether they're in local governments, national governments, industry, et cetera. So that's the main focus, and correct. Yep.
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I think, this would be a good opportunity, and maybe you're already doing it. And somebody had mentioned it, yesterday, but, papers, you said scientists write papers and, the information is not always portrayed in a way that's useful, but, the Indigenous voice, we need to get more of them in these scientific papers. And, I don't know if you're already doing that, but I think that your platform would be a great place to do it.
Thanks. I think probably both Jackie and Athena could say something about that, about how we're seeing not just scientific voices, but Indigenous voices and work we've got underway.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's absolutely essential. And I think it's not just scientific papers and products that we're interested in creating. It's really a synthesis, and we use that word a lot, of bringing together the best available information that does already exist and packaging it, tailoring it to audiences who need it most. And the part of the beauty and the power of what we're trying to do in this version of Surge is Surge has been co-designed from the beginning. So Jackie and Vera and a handful of the other decision-making experts and scientific experts, they designed this phase of Search from the ground up so that there's this balance between these different areas of expertise. So yeah, I mean, I don't really know how many scientific studies are going to come out of this phase of Search, but what I know will come out of this phase of Search is not necessarily only scientific studies that are co-authored by Indigenous and decision-making experts, but essays and articles and presentations and town hall meetings and podcast episodes that are constantly striving to synthesize the best available knowledge that is out there about Arctic environmental change and to make it meaningful and sticky and responsive to the needs of the communities. And yeah, it's going to be a big effort, I think, but essential that all of those areas of expertise are represented.
Jackie, you want to say a little something about the contribution you've been working on for the Arctic report card?
Well, I don't want to put, let the cat out of the bag, but I think the point that I would make is that there are many methods of communication. And what we don't want to do is limit ourselves to publications. As an Indigenous person, I come from, I could say, a long line of storytellers, but oral historians, changing that dialogue, but creating maybe science books for children so that they understand when a scientist comes to their community, they understand what a scientist is and how they could help that community build capacity or learn more about their natural environment. So I think that we really want to focus on our ability to change how we produce outcomes, right? In many different methods of communication, be it visual, be it oral. I interviewed someone recently, an elder, and he has been told several times, you should write a book, you should write a book. And what I realized after I've known him for many, many years, every time I leave and from talking with him that I learned so much, but he is an oral historian for his people. He is not a book writer. We could record him and transcribe it, but the way he says it and the way it resonates in my mind and into how I memorize it is that information is communicated in a method that is very intimate to humanity. And we've kind of gotten away from that. So I think we just want to make sure that we don't zero in on one way of communicating, because reading is very different than listening.
And I just want to say one more thing about that, which is that this realization that we have to share what is known, John, with diverse audiences, that's a lot of work, right? It's not enough to write a paper and put it in a magazine and think you're done, because there also might need to be an oral history component. There also might need to be a video component. So we all learn that, right? That you have to communicate with your specific audience. But if we're going to practice that, it's going to take more work than typically happens. But I think it's the necessary work. I think Church has a microphone and is ready to use it.
Hello? Okay, good. Dr. Kelly, distinguished colleagues, exceptional set of presentations and reflections. I'm just inspired, frankly, in what you're trying to accomplish. There's multidisciplinary approach of connecting and communicating the environmental change happening across the Arctic region is a phenomenal endeavor, frankly. As you look to the things that are kind of the near-term priorities versus the long-term goals, it'd be interesting how you're going to prioritize your efforts, because you could be, frankly, you could be a lot of things to a lot of people. And it's quite remarkable that you'd be able to get at that. You need a task force maybe of 1,000 people or a network of 1,000 people to get to that, perhaps. I'd be interested to see what you consider perhaps your near-term priorities. And then I'll follow up with a remark thing. I'm shepherding a new effort within DoD in a security lens. And so please know that our small and growing team, though, would be happy really be able to partner and collaborate with you, and where you see the lens connecting with your work with our princely security defense. Your thoughts,
Right.
sir?
So first of all, we accept your offer. Kennedy, could you hear our friend Church? Okay, so he started out by saying wonderful things about us, as he's wont to do. So that's nice, thank you. And then he said, did I do this right? How are we going to prioritize? Because obviously what we described is huge, and we could, go on forever, and both in the near term and the long term. Did I get that right? All right, great. So first of all, I just want to say I agree with him about how great it is what we're doing. The second thing I want to say, though, is that it's, as churches want to do, he zeroed in on a really important question. And this was, frankly, a challenge for us in writing the proposal, because we thought, okay, if we do the usual thing in an NSF proposal, and we spell out exactly what are going to do, what our priorities are going to be, what are going to be the outcomes, that'll be great, and reviewers will love it. But that's getting ahead of ourselves, because what the first task, which we've now completed, was collecting these co-production teams. They have to make that determination. They have to, by their insights, particularly the people from the communities, but also the scientists, they have to come together and say, well, what together can we work on in this huge area of human well-being, or this huge area of ecological change, or this huge area of international cooperation? So we understood that it'd have to get very specific, but the 9 of us weren't sufficient to make that call. Somehow we said it in a way that the reviewers said, yeah, that makes sense, we'll do that. We're in that process right now of getting these teams to say, well, we're not going to cover everything in this realm, but here are the things that we think are the near-term priorities. So that's that. In terms of the long-term priority, I'm going to be really happy. I mean, I'm going to be ecstatically happy if at the end of 5 years of doing this, we've changed the conversation some, right? And we've made a new way, new outcomes, as my friend Jackie likes to put it, feasible to the people who come behind us, and they can build on it and make it better. So I think that humility is important. We're not going to change the world. And yes, we would love to work with you guys and put your legions to work. So I think I'm about to get the hook. So thank you very much for listening.